Duke, Kentucky, North Carolina, UCLA. You already know the Blue Bloods who have made the Final Four a second home of sorts. When the calendar turns to March, it is the usual suspects who usually find themselves in contention during college basketball's final weekend. However, every once in a while, every now and again, an interloper does manage to crash the party like Cody in his van from Step by Step.
I know a girl who would never go out with you. My stepsister.
She breathing?
I got $20 that she won't go out with you.
You're on.
And 35 years later, that would go on to become the inspiration for just about every porno produced. Moving on. The Final Four, as I mentioned, has featured some not so familiar faces over the years. Obviously, we all remember Florida Atlantic appearing in the 2023 Final Four, or at least we should. That brings me to this point about this video. I'm not going to cover a bunch of recent teams, nor am I going to focus on those programs who reached multiple Final Fours, even if it happened years and decades ago. Holy Cross and La Salle won a national title and were powerhouses for a hot minute back in the day. Even if the latter does sound like the name of a pasta dish, I couldn't actually find that Always Sunny quote online, but if you know, you know. Today, here on the Touchback, we're looking at the true outliers. Here are 11 schools you never knew reached the Final Four, but first, this.
All right, I got a new jersey in from, well, you know the name of the company. Let's see what we... Are you kidding me? Women's shorts? What is this? Just string? Is this thing just falling apart already? Why don't they just make jerseys like they did back in the day?
Actually, someone is making jerseys like they used to. Royal Retros is all about high quality jerseys from those teams that just aren't with us anymore. From the World League and Original XFL to the ABA and WHA, Royal Retros is preserving sports history with some of the coolest jerseys made to last a lot longer than some of those teams existed. In an era when sports apparel is all about getting less for more, Royal Retros is giving you more for less. Now that's a true throwback.
If this is the future of buying jerseys, well, I'd much rather shop in the past.
For a 10% discount on your next Royal Retros order, use the promo code TOUCHBACK. The link is in the video description. And even if you don't want to buy, visiting their website is worth it because you will not believe some of the teams they have on offer. Now back to your regularly scheduled video. We start in Laramie. Not only did Wyoming reach the Final Four in 1943, but they won the whole damn thing in the process. Of course, this comes with a few caveats. Firstly, only 8 teams reached the tournament, so half the field would qualify for the Final Four in 1943. Also, the NIT National Invitational Tournament, sort of a big deal during this time as well, so that muddies waters further. However, there were only a handful of teams that could outright claim to be America's best during the 40s and 50s. Wyoming would be one of those. That's because they actually faced off against the NIT champion that year. So here's the backstory. The NIT and NCAA championships for men's basketball were played on consecutive nights at Madison Square Garden. St. John's won the NIT and then went on to claim they were the best team in college basketball. Wyoming said, not so fast. We, the NCAA champions, are actually the best team in the sport. The two schools came together and organized a charity exhibition with proceeds going to the Red Cross and World War II efforts. A few days after each team had won their respective tournaments, they clashed with the Wyoming Cowboys coming out on top in this contest at MSG. With that victory, they claimed the unrecognized title of undisputed college basketball champions. Wyoming was led by Ken Sailors, one of a handful of players around this time who helped popularize the jump shot. Wyoming's defense of its national championship would be severely disrupted when Sailors went on to serve in the war. He came back for the 1945-46 season, but the Cowboys would fall short of reaching either the NCAA tournament or the NIT. I actually remember moseying on into Wyoming's arena auditorium when seeing a Wyoming football game a while back, looking up at the rafters and seeing that national championship banner hanging. And it did kind of make me think about this. Wyoming has a men's college basketball championship, something like half of the schools in the SEC, despite being so scary fantastic, cannot claim. What if I told you there was an entity that could go on to claim 14 appearances in the Final Four, and most people hadn't even realized it? Well, some of you out there recognizing my use of the word entity probably believe some chicanery is afoot, and you would be correct. That's because we are talking about Vacated. Vacated has some 14 Final Four appearances in the NCAA men's college basketball record books dating all the way back to 1961 and the St. Joseph's Hawks. they would have made a fairly interesting entrant into this video. So would say like the 1971 Western Kentucky Hilltoppers or the 1995 UMass Minutemen. Alas, they do not get to be counted because according to the NCAA, they never technically appeared in the Final Four. This place is vacated among the bluest of college basketball's blue bloods in terms of postseason success. Quite frankly, it's a run not seen by Vacated since the stretch it had with the WCW World Heavyweight Championship circa 2000. When I say North Carolina school in Final Four, I'm guessing your first thought is to North Carolina or Duke or NC State or Wake Forest. Yet in 1977, it was the UNC Charlotte 49ers who were among the last teams standing in the bracket. It actually capped off an absolutely absurd rise for a program that was playing NAIA ball some 7 seasons earlier. The 49ers moved to D1 in 70-71 as an independent, put together some solid campaigns, reached the NIT final in 75-76 where they lost to Kentucky, and entered the 1976-77 season with some expectations. This would be their first year in the Sun Belt Conference, something that in theory made it easier for them to qualify for the big dance. As an independent, obviously they would need the selection committee to bestow upon them an at-large bid, something that hadn't been forthcoming the previous seasons. Not only did Charlotte win the Sun Belt Conference regular season and conference tournaments in the first time of asking, their first appearance in March Madness saw them go all the way to the Final Four. The run was highlighted by an upset of number 1 seeded Michigan in the Elite Eight, a side that had spent a lot of the year ranked top in the national polls. The 49ers were led by Cedric Cornbread Maxwell, a player who is best known as being the 1981 NBA Finals MVP for the Boston Celtics. On the bench for the 49ers was head coach Lee Rose, who would leave for Purdue a season later, take the Boilermakers to a Final Four in 1980, and depart West Lafayette almost immediately afterwards when he ran foul of the athletic director. Sadly, things have not gone all that well for Charlotte outside of that first Final Four appearance in 1977. In fact, the 49ers haven't even advanced past the tournament's first weekend since then. George Mason's inclusion into the NCAA tournament in 2006 was met with derision from power conference schools and their head coaches who did not believe the Patriots deserved an at-large bid that season. Head coach Jim Larinaga and a ragtag cast of characters made the doubters eat it and eat it hard. As an 11th seed, George Mason would go on to upset some of college basketball's most well-known blue bloods in the form of Michigan State, North Carolina, and UConn on their way to that unlikely Final Four berth. That game against UConn, by the way, was such an odd dichotomy of college basketball programs. On one side, you had UConn, a school whose team featured 5 players who went on to be NBA draft picks. George Mason had Jai Lewis, the smallest power forward who received an NFL tryout. I've actually done a review of the game between George Mason and UConn because it's absolutely wild. You can check out that video in the upper right-hand corner of your screen right now. The Patriots' stay in the Final Four was not particularly memorable as they were blown out by eventual champions Florida. Santa Clara's first appearance in the NCAA tournament in 1952 would actually be their best as they made it all the way to the national semifinal. If we are being honest though, they were only invited to the big dance because of geographic technicalities. At this point in time, conferences could only have one team in the NCAA tournament. For the Pacific Coast Conference, that would be UCLA. Meanwhile, there were not a lot of independent programs playing basketball out west, so when Seattle, we will get to them later on in this video, accepted an invite to the NIT, 17-12 Santa Clara was just sort of there. The Broncos did have an interesting road to the 52 Final Four. They beat Wyoming in the West to regional finals. That came one day after they had upset UCLA in the first round. This would be the Broncos' second victory over the Bruins in 1951-52. The run did come to an end at the Final Four in the first going when Kansas kind of just wiped the floor with them. And as for UCLA, well, it would take some time, but their head coach John Wooden, I'd say he did okay for himself. The next 3 entrants in this video all come from the same Final Four, that being the 1970 edition. What an absolutely odd collection of teams this is. You have UCLA, perennial contenders at this point in time. The Bruins are joined by New Mexico State, Jacksonville, and St. Bonaventure. 3 schools, 3 programs who haven't made it back to the Final Four since. Now, each of their stories, each of their paths to the Final Four, does share a few similarities. Let's start with the Dolphins of Jacksonville. They had a Hall of Famer playing for them in the shape of Artis Gilmore. The dude was just unstoppable, averaging 20 and 20 for his college career. Their path to the Final Four was arguably the most difficult, as well as they had to overcome number 1 seed Kentucky in the process. St. Bonaventure had their own Hall of Famer in Bob Lanier, who was equally as dominant. Getting to the Final Four was a bit easier for the Bonnies. They beat Davidson, overcame NC State before blowing out Villanova in the regional final. That victory also saw St. Bonaventure avenge its only regular season loss. Unfortunately for the team, Lanier would hurt his knee in that game. He would be unable to suit up against Jacksonville in the national semifinal, which the Dolphins went on to win. Then we have New Mexico State, who didn't count a Hall of Famer among their ranks, but still had some talented players at their disposal. In fact, their combo of guard Jimmy Collins and center Sam Lacey might have been college basketball's best. Both would go on to be 1970 first-round picks in the NBA draft. But yeah, that 1970 Final Four, just what an odd, random assortment of teams who did have things working in their favor. Like, these were not sad sack sides who got lucky. They had talented players. Sadly, they were all just cannon fodder for the UCLA Bruins, as just about everyone in college basketball was at the time. Seattle University basketball doesn't arrive on the scene until the late 1940s, and for those first few seasons, no one really thinks much of them. Then, out of nowhere, they beat the Harlem Globetrotters in the early 50s and were regularly appearing in the NCAA tournament. A major reason for this, SU was letting players play on the basketball team regardless of race or nationality. In fact, the school has gone on to gloss itself as the United Nations of college basketball. Their star was none other than Elgin Baylor, who had somehow found himself at the College of Idaho of all places after high school. Shout out to the Yotes, who've had themselves a heck of a season at the NAIA level this year. Back to Seattle University. So Baylor runs into some issues at the College of Idaho. The basketball coach leaves. The administration does some shady stuff with scholarships, and he needs a new place to play. Eventually, he makes his way to, I guess, somewhat nearby Seattle University and becomes college basketball's best player, bar none. The road to the Final Four was not easy for Seattle, by the way. They beat San Francisco, the Dons coming off 3 straight Final Four appearances, and Cal at the Cow Palace. They then beat Kansas State in the Final Four to set up a showdown with Kentucky, who had spent most of the 1950s doing some of the dodgiest, shadiest stuff seen in college basketball history. We're talking point shaving, match fixing, although they were terrible at match fixing and couldn't actually get the desired result. And then, of course, there was just the blatant racism of Kentucky basketball at the time. Despite the game being in Louisville in front of an all-white crowd, Seattle hung tough early on and even had a double-digit lead in the first half. Eventually, they ran out of gas and would succumb to Kentucky in the championship game. Seattle University did remain a player in the Division I level for most of the 1960s, but the program nosedives in the 1970s as part of a larger sort of economic slump in Seattle due to Boeing's crash. They make their way to NAIA during the 80s. They do bounce back up to D1 in the early 2010s, but another run to the Final Four seems extremely unlikely for Seattle University. The Bicentennial was extremely kind to Rutgers athletics. The football team has a perfect season and goes 11-0 in 1976. But they were actually the second team to complete an unbeaten regular season because the men's basketball side finished the 75-76 campaign 28-0, including winning the ECAC Metro tournament. Not bad for a program who'd only made its first NCAA tournament appearance a year earlier. Led by Phil Sellers and Eddie Jordan, Rutgers played really, really fast. Well, apart from Princeton, who just slowed them and everyone else they played down. In fact, the Tigers almost upset Rutgers in the first round of March Madness that season. The Scarlet Knights advanced, found themselves in the Final Four, but sadly they did not finish the year unbeaten. Michigan upset them in the national semifinal. Heartbreaking indeed, but for Eddie Jordan, oh man, I wish I could go back in time and warn you, because your career is going to get worse, much, much worse. Dayton's history in terms of college athletics does not nearly get the attention or credit it deserves. Firstly, they pretty much ruined Division III football for just about everyone. It got to the point where they were barred from competing from the title at the D3 football level. Meanwhile, their basketball program has just been chugging along for more than 120 years now, routinely punching above their weight. However, the Flyers flew highest in 1967 when they made it all the way to the national championship game, only to be brushed aside by UCLA and its sophomore center Lou Alcindor. If we're being honest, Dayton was a real underdog here, not just an obscure name who had a Hall of Famer or future NBAers in their ranks. Like, this Dayton Flyers team in 1976 didn't have a lot of standout talent. The team was led by Don May, a solid hand who spent some time in the NBA but who was hardly a game changer. The rest of the roster was guys who I could give you their names, but no one's going to know who they were. But yeah, they somehow just were fighting and scrapping and clawing and got that sole Final Four appearance for Dayton. It should be noted, though, the school has found far more success in the NIT, having won it on 3 occasions and reaching the final 5 other times. In fact, I would probably argue that Dayton is a blue blood when it comes to the National Invitational Tournament, but I don't think that title would hold much weight. So there you have it, 11 schools most people probably don't realize reached the Final Four at some point in history. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to know more about how, if the NCAA must expand March Madness, they should do it by this method, you can check out the video in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. And for more on the 1976 Rutgers football season, video lower left-hand corner of your screen. Until next time, I'm Cheyenne Hollis. This is the Touchback, and as always, hashtag take out the 25.